Marcus Chen had always been the quiet one in his family. While his older brother David commanded attention with his loud voice and confident swagger, Marcus preferred to observe from the shadows. At 24, he worked as a night security guard at Westfield Industrial Complex, a job that suited his introverted nature perfectly. The empty hallways and silent machinery provided him with the solitude he craved. On that fateful Tuesday evening in October, Marcus was finishing his rounds when he noticed something unusual. The loading dock door, which should have been securely locked, was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of orange light escaped through the gap, casting an eerie glow across the concrete floor. Marcus approached cautiously, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight on his belt. As he drew closer, he could hear voices coming from inside the warehouse. This was highly irregular. The facility was supposed to be completely empty during his shift. Marcus pressed his ear against the cold metal door, trying to make out what was being said. The voices were muffled, but he could detect at least 3 different speakers engaged in what sounded like an intense discussion. His heart began to race as he realized he was witnessing something he shouldn't be seeing. Through the crack in the door, Marcus could make out several figures moving around large wooden crates. They wore dark clothing and moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first time conducting business in his warehouse. Marcus knew he should call the police immediately, but something held him back. Perhaps it was curiosity. Or maybe it was the fear that he might be overreacting to what could be a legitimate late-night delivery. He decided to observe a little longer, positioning himself where he could see more clearly through the gap. What he witnessed next changed everything. One of the men opened a crate, revealing stacks of what appeared to be cash bundled in plastic wrap. Another man was counting bills with mechanical precision, while a third figure stood guard near a side entrance Marcus hadn't even known existed. The operation was clearly illegal, and Marcus found himself holding his breath as he watched thousands of dollars change hands. The reality of his situation hit him like a physical blow. He was witnessing what appeared to be a money laundering operation taking place right under his nose in the warehouse he was supposed to be protecting. His mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Were other security guards involved? Was his supervisor, Mr. Thompson, aware of these activities? As if responding to his thoughts, Marcus heard a familiar voice join the conversation inside. His blood ran cold as he recognized the distinctive gravelly tone of Mr. Thompson himself. The man who had hired Marcus, who had praised his reliability and discretion, was apparently orchestrating this entire operation. Marcus backed away from the door, his legs suddenly unsteady. He needed to get away from this place and think clearly about what to do next. But as he turned to leave, his foot caught on a loose piece of metal piping that had been carelessly left on the ground. The clang echoed through the loading dock area like a gunshot in the silence. Everything inside the warehouse went quiet. Marcus froze, hoping against hope that they hadn't heard the noise or would dismiss it as something falling naturally. But footsteps were already approaching the door from the inside. He had perhaps 30 seconds before they would investigate the source of the sound. Panic took over. Marcus ran toward the security office, his mind racing faster than his feet. He needed to act normal, to be exactly where he was supposed to be when they came looking. He burst through the office door and threw himself into his chair, grabbing a clipboard and pretending to review his nightly checklist. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Marcus tried to control his breathing, to appear calm and focused on his routine duties. When Mr. Thompson appeared at the office window 20 minutes later, Marcus forced himself to look up with what he hoped appeared to be mild surprise. "Working hard tonight, Marcus?" Thompson's voice carried its usual friendly tone, but Marcus detected something else underneath, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "Just finishing up my rounds, sir. Everything looks good out there." Marcus hoped his voice didn't betray the terror he felt inside. Thompson studied him for a long moment, his eyes searching Marcus's face for any sign of deception. Good, good. Listen, I need to discuss some schedule changes with you. Why don't you come by my office tomorrow afternoon, say, around 3? Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Thompson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, and left without another word. As soon as he was gone, Marcus slumped in his chair, his entire body trembling with adrenaline and fear. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of anxiety and indecision. Marcus went through the motions of his security rounds, but his mind was entirely focused on the impossible situation he found himself in. By the time dawn broke and his replacement arrived, he had made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Instead of going home to his small apartment as he usually did, Marcus drove to the police station. Detective Sarah Rodriguez listened patiently as he recounted everything he had witnessed. She asked detailed questions, took careful notes, and assured him that his information was valuable and that he had done the right thing by coming forward. What Marcus didn't know was that the police had been investigating suspicious activity at Westfield Industrial Complex for months. His testimony provided the missing piece they needed to obtain search warrants and build a case against the operation. Detective Rodriguez explained that Marcus would need to continue working normally while they gathered additional evidence, but that his safety was their primary concern. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus lived in a constant state of fear and hypervigilance. Every interaction with Thompson felt loaded with hidden meaning. Every shadow in the warehouse seemed to conceal a potential threat. He followed Detective Rodriguez's instructions carefully, documenting unusual activities and avoiding any behavior that might raise suspicions. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night when Marcus witnessed another exchange, this time involving different players. He recognized one of the new faces as Vincent Moretti, a man whose photograph had been in the local newspaper in connection with several investigations into organized crime. The scope of what Marcus had stumbled into was far larger than he had initially realized. Marcus dutifully reported this development to Detective Rodriguez, who seemed both excited and concerned by the new information. She explained that Marcus's cooperation was helping them build a case against a criminal network that extended far beyond the warehouse. However, she also warned him that the stakes were now much higher, and his safety could be at serious risk if his role as an informant was discovered. The warning proved prophetic sooner than anyone expected. The following Monday, Marcus arrived at work to find Thompson waiting for him with 2 other men he didn't recognize. The atmosphere in the security office was thick with tension, and Marcus knew immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. "Marcus, we need to have a talk," Thompson said, his voice now stripped of any pretense of friendliness. "It seems someone has been sharing information about our operations with people who shouldn't have it. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Marcus tried to maintain his composure, but he could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead. "I don't understand what you're talking about, sir. I just do my security rounds like always." One of the other men, a large individual with scarred hands and cold eyes, stepped closer to Marcus. "We know you've been talking to the police, kid. The question is whether you're going to cooperate with us now or whether we're going to have a problem." The threat was unmistakable, and Marcus felt his carefully constructed facade crumbling. His hands began to shake as he realized that his secret had been exposed. Someone had betrayed him, or perhaps the criminals had their own sources within the police department. Either way, his cover was blown, and he was now in immediate danger. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Marcus tried one last time to deny the accusations, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. Thompson laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Cut the act, Marcus. We know everything. The question now is what we're going to do about it." Marcus's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out of this situation. He was trapped in the security office with 3 dangerous criminals who knew he had been working with the police. The nearest exit was behind Thompson, and even if he could somehow get past all 3 men, he had no idea where he could go that would be safe. "Here's what's going to happen," the large man continued. "You're going to call your police friends and tell them you made a mistake. You're going to say you misunderstood what you saw and that there's nothing illegal happening here. Then you're going to forget everything you think you know about our business." Marcus knew that agreeing to their demands would likely mean the end of the police investigation and would leave him permanently under the control of these criminals. But refusing would almost certainly result in immediate violence, and he was outnumbered 3-1 with no weapon and no way to call for help. "And if I don't?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. The scarred man smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "Then you'll regret it. We'll make sure of that." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus understood that he had reached a crossroads where every choice led to danger, but some paths were more immediately fatal than others. He looked at each of the 3 men in turn, trying to read their intentions and assess his options. Thompson seemed to interpret his hesitation as defiance. "You have until tomorrow night to make the call, Marcus. After that, we'll assume you've made your choice, and we'll respond accordingly." As the 3 men prepared to leave, Marcus realized that his time was running out rapidly. He had perhaps 24 hours to find a solution to an impossible situation. The criminal network knew about his cooperation with the police, which meant he could no longer rely on Detective Rodriguez for protection without putting her investigation at risk. But Marcus had underestimated his own resourcefulness and determination. As he sat alone in the security office after the criminals departed, he began to formulate a plan that was both desperate and brilliant. He couldn't go to the police without exposing their investigation, and he couldn't comply with the criminals' demands without becoming their permanent prisoner. Instead, Marcus decided to disappear entirely. He would become the ghost that the title of his story suggested, vanishing from his old life so completely that neither the criminals nor the police would be able to find him. It was a radical solution that would require him to abandon everything he had ever known, but it was the only path he could see that led to survival. The next 18 hours were a whirlwind of careful preparation. Marcus used his security access to gather evidence that he could use as insurance if he was ever discovered. He documented the criminal operation with photographs and detailed notes, creating a comprehensive record that would be valuable to law enforcement even if he wasn't around to testify. He also began the process of erasing his digital footprint, using techniques he had learned from crime documentaries and online forums. Marcus closed his bank accounts, canceled his lease, and sold everything he owned that couldn't fit into a single backpack. By the time his next shift was scheduled to begin, Marcus Chen would no longer exist in any official capacity. The transformation was both liberating and terrifying. As he prepared to leave his apartment for the last time, Marcus looked around at the life he was abandoning. The modest furniture, the few photographs of family gatherings, the books and personal items that had defined his identity, all of it would be left behind as he embarked on a journey into the unknown. His family would never understand his disappearance. His parents, who had immigrated from Taiwan and worked tirelessly to build a better life for their children, would be devastated by his sudden absence. His brother David would probably assume Marcus had suffered some kind of mental breakdown and disappeared voluntarily. But Marcus knew that any attempt to explain the situation would only put his family in danger. The criminals had demonstrated their willingness to use threats and violence, and Marcus couldn't risk exposing his loved ones to that kind of threat. His disappearance would have to remain a mystery, at least for now. As the sun set on what would be his last day in his hometown, Marcus made his final preparations for the transformation that would turn him from a living person into a ghost. He had chosen a new identity, researched his destination, and prepared for a journey that would take him far from everything familiar. The most difficult part was writing the letters he would never send, explanations to his family and friends that would remain forever undelivered. In these letters, Marcus poured out his love and regret, his hopes that they would eventually understand and forgive his disappearance. But he knew these words would remain locked away with his old identity, part of the life he was leaving behind. As midnight approached, Marcus Chen took one last look at himself in the bathroom mirror. The face staring back at him was familiar, but would soon belong to a memory. Tomorrow, he would begin learning to be someone else entirely, someone with no connection to the quiet security guard who had stumbled onto a criminal conspiracy. The final step was the hardest of all. Marcus took out his cell phone and deleted every contact, every message, and every photograph that connected him to his former life. Then he removed the battery and threw both pieces into a dumpster several blocks from his apartment. The symbolic gesture felt like a death, the moment when Marcus Chen officially ceased to exist. But as he walked away from his old life into the darkness of the early morning, Marcus felt something unexpected alongside the fear and grief. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely free. The quiet, observant man who had spent years in the shadows was about to discover what it meant to disappear entirely. And in that disappearance, he would find a strength he never knew he possessed. 6 months had passed since Marcus Chen had vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but questions and a growing legend among those who knew him. In his new life as Michael Carson, he had found work as a groundskeeper at a remote mountain resort in Colorado, 3 states away from the life he had abandoned. The job suited his need for solitude and his desire to remain invisible to the world that had once threatened to destroy him. The resort, Pine Ridge Lodge, was owned by an elderly couple named Frank and Eleanor Martinez, who had built their business on providing city dwellers with an escape from modern life. The property sprawled across 200 acres of pristine wilderness, with hiking trails that led deep into the national forest and cabins scattered throughout the grounds like hidden gems waiting to be discovered. Marcus had chosen the name Michael Carson carefully. It was common enough to blend into any crowd, but distinctive enough that he could respond to it naturally. He had practiced writing the signature until it became second nature, and he had crafted a believable backstory about being a former military veteran seeking solitude after a difficult deployment overseas. The story explained his preference for isolation and his reluctance to discuss his past in detail. Frank Martinez had hired him without asking too many questions. The old man seemed to understand that some people came to the mountains to escape something, and he respected the boundaries that his new employee had quietly established. Eleanor was more curious by nature, but even she had learned to appreciate Marcus's reliable work ethic and his gentle way with the guests who occasionally needed directions or assistance. The work itself was meditative. Marcus spent his days maintaining the hiking trails, repairing fences, and ensuring that the cabins were properly winterized as the seasons changed. The physical labor helped him sleep at night, and the mountain air gradually began to heal wounds he hadn't even realized he was carrying from his former life. But peace was a fragile thing, and Marcus discovered that running from one's past was more complicated than simply changing names and locations. The news from his hometown followed him through internet searches and social media posts that he couldn't resist checking despite knowing the danger they represented. Detective Sarah Rodriguez had been forced to close the investigation into the Westfield Industrial Complex when their primary witness disappeared without explanation. The criminal network that Marcus had discovered continued to operate, apparently more careful now, but still functioning. Thompson had told the police that Marcus had simply stopped showing up for work, and there was no evidence to suggest anything more sinister had occurred. Marcus's family had filed a missing person report, and his brother David had even hired a private investigator to search for clues about his disappearance. The investigation had turned up nothing useful, and after 3 months, even David had been forced to accept that his brother was either dead or had chosen to disappear voluntarily. Reading about his family's pain was like swallowing broken glass. Marcus found himself torn between the safety of his new identity and the guilt of causing such suffering to people who loved him. His parents had aged visibly in the photographs posted on social media, and his mother's posts spoke of lighting candles and praying for her missing son's safe return. The emotional weight of his decision was compounded by the practical challenges of maintaining a false identity. Marcus had to be constantly vigilant about avoiding situations that might require official identification or background checks. He paid for everything in cash, avoided medical care unless absolutely necessary, and stayed away from any activities that might put him in contact with law enforcement. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. While it protected him from discovery, it also meant that Marcus had no one to confide in about the burden he was carrying. He began to understand why some people described living under an assumed identity as a kind of death. The person he had been was gone, but the person he was becoming felt hollow and incomplete. Winter arrived early in the mountains that year, blanketing Pine Ridge Lodge in snow by late October. The resort's busy season was winding down, and Marcus found himself with longer stretches of solitude as fewer guests braved the increasingly treacherous mountain roads. It was during one of these quiet periods that he encountered someone who would fundamentally change his understanding of what it meant to be a ghost. Sarah Kim was a journalist from Denver who had come to Pine Ridge Lodge to work on a book about people who had chosen to disappear from modern society. She was in her early 30s, with sharp eyes and an easy smile that made people want to tell her their stories. Frank had warned Marcus about her presence, mentioning that she might try to interview some of the staff for her research. Marcus had planned to avoid her entirely, but fate intervened when Sarah's rental car got stuck in a snowdrift while she was exploring one of the more remote trails. Marcus discovered her vehicle while checking the property boundaries and found Sarah attempting to dig herself out with a collapsible shovel that was clearly inadequate for the task. "Need some help?" Marcus asked, approaching cautiously with a proper snow shovel and a bag of sand from his utility truck. Sarah looked up gratefully, her cheeks red from cold and exertion. "I would definitely appreciate that. I think I was a little too ambitious about where this car could go." As Marcus worked to free her vehicle, Sarah studied him with the kind of attention that made him nervous. He could sense her journalist's instincts, analyzing his appearance, his accent, and his behavior for clues about his story. But her questions were casual and respectful, focusing on the resort and the local area rather than personal details. "You must see a lot of people come through here looking for something," Sarah said as Marcus positioned his truck to tow her car back to solid ground. "People come to the mountains for all kinds of reasons," Marcus replied carefully. "Most of them are just trying to get away from the noise for a while." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "In my research, I've discovered that there are basically two types of disappearances. There are people who vanish because they're running from something specific: debt, crime, failed relationships. And then there are people who disappear because they're searching for something they can't find in their regular lives." The distinction hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had always thought of himself as someone running from danger, but Sarah's words made him question whether there was more to his decision than simple survival. Had he been searching for something even before the criminal conspiracy forced his hand? "Which type do you think is more common?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "The runners are more dramatic, so they get more attention in the media. But I think the searchers are actually more numerous. They're just quieter about it, and they're less likely to get caught because they're not leaving behind obvious problems that people want to solve." As they secured the tow rope between the vehicles, Marcus found himself wanting to continue the conversation despite the risks it represented. Sarah had a way of discussing disappearance that stripped away the melodrama and treated it as a legitimate life choice, rather than a psychological disorder or criminal act. "Are you planning to interview people for your book?" Marcus asked. "Only volunteers. I'm not interested in outing anyone or violating their privacy. I'm more curious about the experience itself, what it's like to rebuild yourself from scratch, and whether people find what they're looking for when they leave everything behind." The conversation continued during the drive back to the resort, and Marcus found himself drawn into a discussion that felt dangerous, but necessary. Sarah had spent 2 years researching voluntary disappearances, and her insights challenged many of his assumptions about his own situation. "The thing that surprises people most," Sarah said as they reached the main lodge, "is how difficult it is to maintain a false identity in the digital age. It's not like the movies where you can just change your name and start over. Modern life requires constant verification of who you are, and that creates a kind of existential exhaustion for people living under assumed identities." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Sarah's words perfectly described the constant low-level stress that had become his normal state of existence. He was always one random encounter, one computer glitch, one stroke of bad luck away from having his carefully constructed life collapse. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself drawn into regular conversations with Sarah as she continued her research at the resort. She was careful never to push for personal information, but their discussions about identity, freedom, and the nature of authentic existence became the highlight of his otherwise solitary days. Through Sarah, Marcus began to understand that his experience was part of a larger phenomenon. Thousands of people chose to disappear from their old lives every year, for reasons ranging from domestic violence to financial ruin to simple dissatisfaction with the paths they had chosen. The internet had made it both easier to research how to disappear and harder to actually accomplish it successfully. "The paradox of modern disappearance," Sarah explained one evening as they sat by the lodge's fireplace, "is that the same technology that helps people plan their vanishing also makes it nearly impossible to stay hidden permanently. Eventually, most people have to choose between complete isolation and gradual reintegration into society." Marcus realized that he had been unconsciously avoiding that choice, living in a kind of limbo where he was neither fully hidden nor genuinely present in the world. Sarah's research suggested that this middle ground was unsustainable in the long term. People who tried to maintain it usually either got caught or suffered psychological breakdowns from the constant stress. The turning point came when Sarah shared a story about a man she had interviewed who had successfully disappeared for 5 years before choosing to resurface and face the consequences of his past. The man had realized that running from his problems hadn't solved them, and that the energy he was spending on hiding could be better used addressing the issues that had driven him away in the first place. "What happened to him?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "It wasn't easy," Sarah admitted. "He had to deal with legal consequences, financial problems, and damaged relationships. But he said the relief of not having to pretend to be someone else was worth all of the difficulties. He felt like he got his life back, even though it wasn't the same life he had left behind." That night, Marcus lay awake in his small cabin thinking about the man in Sarah's story. He tried to imagine what it would feel like to stop looking over his shoulder, to use his real name again, to call his parents and tell them he was alive. The fantasy was both appealing and terrifying. But the next morning brought news that shattered any romantic notions Marcus might have had about returning to his old life. Sarah showed him a news article she had found while researching another story. Detective Sarah Rodriguez had been found dead in her apartment, the apparent victim of a robbery gone wrong. The timing was suspicious, coming just days after she had announced plans to reopen the Westfield Industrial Complex investigation with new evidence. Marcus felt his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. If the criminals were willing to eliminate a police detective, they would certainly have no qualms about killing a witness who had embarrassed them by disappearing before they could silence him permanently. His decision to vanish had apparently enraged them rather than solving the problem, and now they were escalating their violence. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked, noticing how pale Marcus had become while reading the article. "I'm fine," Marcus lied, but he could see that Sarah wasn't convinced by his answer. "Michael, I want you to know that if you ever need to talk to someone about anything, I'm a good listener, and I understand more about complicated situations than most people." Marcus wanted desperately to tell her everything. The burden of carrying his secret alone had become almost unbearable, and Sarah's understanding of disappearance made her seem like the perfect confidant. But involving her in his situation would put her life at risk, and he couldn't bear the thought of being responsible for another person's death. Instead, he made a decision that would once again change the trajectory of his life. If the criminals were still hunting for him after 6 months, then his current level of hiding wasn't sufficient. He needed to disappear more completely, to become so thoroughly invisible that even a determined search would never find him. Marcus spent the next week making preparations for another vanishing. He would leave Pine Ridge Lodge and Michael Carson behind, just as he had abandoned Marcus Chen and his former life. This time, however, he would disappear so completely that he wouldn't even risk the kind of internet searches that had allowed him to follow news from his hometown. But before he could implement his plan, an unexpected visitor arrived at the resort. David Chen, Marcus's brother, appeared at the front desk asking if anyone had seen a man matching Marcus's description. Frank Martinez, who had no reason to connect his groundskeeper with the missing person inquiry, invited David to speak with all of the staff members to see if anyone might have helpful information. Marcus watched through the window of the maintenance shed as his brother spoke with Eleanor near the main lodge. David looked tired and older than Marcus remembered, and the sight of him brought back a flood of memories from their childhood. They had been close despite their different personalities, and Marcus could see the pain that his disappearance had caused etched into every line of David's face. The temptation to reveal himself was overwhelming. Marcus wanted nothing more than to run to his brother and explain everything, to finally unburden himself of the secret he had been carrying alone for so many months. But he knew that such a reunion would probably sign David's death warrant as well as his own. Instead, Marcus did the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He slipped out the back of the maintenance shed and disappeared into the forest before David could spot him. As he hiked deeper into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back and a small emergency kit, Marcus felt like he was dying all over again. But this time, the death felt different. Instead of the desperate fear that had driven his first disappearance, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. He was finally embracing his role as a ghost completely, letting go of any remaining connections to his former identity. The transformation was both painful and liberating. As Marcus walked deeper into the mountains, leaving behind even the minimal life he had built as Michael Carson, he began to understand what it truly meant to become a ghost. It wasn't just about changing names or locations. It was about releasing all attachment to the person you used to be and accepting that some forms of freedom could only be found in complete solitude. The snow began to fall more heavily as Marcus disappeared into the wilderness, covering his tracks and erasing any sign that he had ever been there at all. Behind him, his brother continued searching for a person who no longer existed, while ahead lay a future that belonged entirely to the ghost Marcus was becoming. In that moment, as the mountain silence closed around him, and the last traces of his old life were buried beneath fresh snow, Marcus finally understood why some people chose to disappear forever. The weight of being someone specific, with a particular history and defined relationships, could become unbearable under certain circumstances. Sometimes the only way to truly live was to die to everything you had been before. The ghost who walked home was no longer walking toward any destination that could be marked on a map. He was walking toward a kind of existence that transcended the ordinary boundaries of identity and belonging. And in that walking, he was finally beginning to find the peace that had eluded him throughout his entire previous life. 2 years had passed since Marcus Chen had walked into the Colorado wilderness, leaving behind even the shadow identity of Michael Carson. The man who had emerged from that forest was someone entirely different, someone who had learned to exist in the spaces between official recognition and complete invisibility. He called himself Tom Rivers now, though the name felt more like a costume than an identity. Tom lived in the ruins of an abandoned mining town called Silverbrook, deep in the Montana wilderness. The settlement had been deserted since the 1950s when the silver veins played out and the mining company pulled up stakes. What remained was a collection of weathered buildings scattered across a mountain valley that rarely appeared on modern maps and was accessible only by hiking trails that few people ever used. He had discovered Silverbrook during a particularly harsh winter when hypothermia and exhaustion had nearly claimed his life. The old mine supervisor's house still had a functioning wood stove and enough structural integrity to provide shelter from the mountain storms. Tom had intended to stay only until spring, but as the months passed, he realized he had found something rare, a place where he could exist without any need for documentation, social interaction, or connection to the modern world. The town had become his entire universe. Tom spent his days repairing the buildings, tending a small garden he had planted behind the old general store, and exploring the network of abandoned mine shafts that honeycombed the mountainside. He had taught himself to hunt and fish, to preserve food for the long winters, and to maintain the solar panels he had salvaged from various sources to power a few essential devices. Most importantly, Tom had learned to live with silence in a way that would have been impossible for the man he used to be. Marcus Chen had always needed the background noise of civilization, television, radio, other people's conversations. But Tom Rivers had discovered that true silence was not empty, but full of subtle sounds that most people never noticed. The wind through pine needles, the distant call of hawks, the crack of settling wood in an old building, these had become his companions. The isolation was not perfect, however. Occasionally, hikers would stumble across Silverbrook and find evidence of habitation. Tom had become expert at avoiding these encounters, disappearing into the mine shafts or the dense forest whenever voices echoed across the valley. He left no obvious signs of his presence, and most visitors assumed that any evidence of recent activity was left by other transient hikers or hunting parties. But on a crisp October morning that felt like an echo of the day Marcus Chen had first discovered the criminal conspiracy, Tom's carefully constructed solitude was shattered by the arrival of someone who was specifically looking for him. Sarah Kim appeared at the edge of the town like a figure from a half-remembered dream. She was older now, her hair streaked with early gray, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had spent considerable time in wilderness environments. Tom watched her from the shadows of the old mine office as she methodically explored the buildings, her journalist's instincts clearly engaged by the discovery of an inhabited ghost town. Tom's first impulse was to remain hidden until she left, as he had done with every other unexpected visitor. But something about Sarah's presence felt different. She wasn't exploring Silverbrook with the casual curiosity of a hiker who had stumbled across something interesting. She was searching with purpose, and Tom had the unsettling realization that she might be searching specifically for him. His suspicions were confirmed when Sarah stopped in front of the supervisor's house where Tom lived and called out in a voice that carried clearly across the valley. "Michael Carson? Or should I say Tom Rivers? I know you're here." The sound of his assumed names spoken aloud hit Tom like a physical blow. He had become so accustomed to existing without identity that hearing himself named felt like a violation of natural law. For a moment, he considered remaining hidden and hoping Sarah would eventually give up and leave. But curiosity overcame caution, and Tom stepped out from behind the mine office where he had been watching. "How did you find me?" Sarah turned toward him with a smile that mixed relief with satisfaction. "It wasn't easy," I've been looking for you for almost 2 years. Tom approached cautiously, his mind racing with questions about how his carefully maintained anonymity had been compromised. Why? Because you're the key to a story I've been investigating, and because I think you're the only person who can help stop something terrible from happening. As Sarah explained her presence in Silverbrook, Tom learned that his disappearance had created consequences he never could have imagined. Detective Rodriguez's murder had sparked a federal investigation into corruption within the local police department. The FBI had discovered that the criminal network Tom had witnessed was far larger and more sophisticated than anyone had realized, with connections to organized crime families across multiple states. They never stopped looking for you, Sarah explained as they sat on the porch of the old general store. Not the criminals, and not the FBI. You're the only witness who can tie everything together, the only person who saw the operation firsthand and can identify all the key players. Tom felt the familiar weight of fear settling over him like a heavy coat. If they're still looking, then I'm still in danger. Coming out of hiding would be suicide. Actually, the situation has changed dramatically in the past 6 months, Sarah said, pulling a tablet computer from her backpack. Thompson was arrested in a raid 3 months ago, along with most of his associates. The federal task force has been dismantling the network piece by piece. As Sarah showed him news articles and court documents, Tom realized that the criminal organization he had been hiding from was largely defunct. Vincent Moretti was in federal custody awaiting trial. The warehouse operation had been shut down. Most of the people who had threatened him were either dead, in prison, or had fled to countries without extradition treaties. But without your testimony, the prosecutions are fragile, Sarah continued. Defense attorneys are arguing that the whole investigation was based on unreliable informants and illegally obtained evidence. Several key defendants might walk free unless someone can provide first-hand testimony about what they witnessed. Tom stared at the tablet screen, struggling to process the implications of what Sarah was telling him. You're saying that all this hiding might have been for nothing? Not for nothing. You stayed alive, which was the most important thing. But now there's an opportunity to come back from the dead, so to speak, and help ensure that the people who forced you to disappear face consequences for their actions. The irony was almost unbearable. Tom had spent 2 years learning to exist as a ghost, only to discover that the haunting could finally end. But the prospect of returning to the world of the living felt almost as terrifying as the original threat that had driven him away. What about my family? Tom asked. They think I'm dead. They've probably moved on with their lives. Sarah's expression softened. Your brother David never stopped looking for you. He hired private investigators, posted on missing person websites, even consulted with psychics. Your parents are older and frailer than when you left, but they still light a candle for you every Sunday at church. The image of his family maintaining hope for his return broke something inside Tom that had been carefully sealed away. He felt tears forming for the first time in months, and with them came a flood of emotions he had taught himself to suppress during his years of isolation. Even if the criminals are gone, how do I explain where I've been? How do I justify putting my family through years of grief when I could have found another way? Sarah leaned back in the old wooden chair, considering her answer carefully. The truth is a good place to start. You witnessed a crime, you reported it to the police, and when you were threatened, you made a survival decision. Most people would understand that choice, especially your family. And what about Michael Carson and Tom Rivers? What about the false identities and the illegal disappearance? Federal witness protection programs have provisions for people who were forced to protect themselves without official help. If you cooperate with the investigation, the government has ways of regularizing your situation retroactively. As the afternoon sun slanted across the abandoned town, Tom found himself facing the most difficult decision of his adult life. He had spent 2 years perfecting the art of invisibility, only to be offered the chance to become visible again. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. "I need time to think about this," Tom said finally. Sarah nodded understandingly. "I can give you a few days, but not much longer. The trials are starting soon, and if you're going to testify, the prosecutors need time to prepare your testimony." That evening, after Sarah had set up camp in one of the other buildings, Tom walked through Silverbrook as he had done countless times before. But now the abandoned town felt different, less like a refuge and more like a prison. The silence that had once comforted him seemed oppressive, and the isolation that had felt like freedom began to feel like a self-imposed exile. He spent the night in the old mine superintendent's house, staring at the wood stove that had kept him warm through 2 harsh winters. The building had become more of a home to him than anywhere he had ever lived, and the thought of leaving it felt like another death. But as dawn broke over the valley, Tom realized that Sarah was right about one thing. Some forms of disappearance were supposed to be temporary. He had become a ghost in order to survive, but survival was not the same as living, and living required the courage to emerge from the shadows and face whatever consequences awaited in the world of the visible. The next morning, Tom found Sarah preparing breakfast over a camp stove outside the old general store. "I'll do it," he said simply. Sarah looked up from her cooking with an expression of relief mixed with concern. "Are you sure? Once we leave here, there's no going back to this life." Tom looked around the valley that had been his entire world for 2 years. The abandoned buildings, the ancient mine shafts, the forest paths he had walked countless times, all of it would soon become memory. But for the first time since arriving in Silverbrook, the prospect of leaving didn't fill him with panic. "I can't stay a ghost forever," Tom said. "It's time to find out if Marcus Chen can come back from the dead." The journey back to civilization took 3 days of hiking through wilderness that Tom knew better than any map. With each mile they traveled away from Silverbrook, he felt pieces of his carefully constructed isolation falling away. By the time they reached Sarah's SUV at a remote trailhead, Tom Rivers had largely disappeared, leaving behind someone who was ready to reclaim the name Marcus Chen. The transformation was not instantaneous or easy. The federal marshals who took Marcus into protective custody were amazed by his story and impressed by his survival skills, but they were also concerned about his psychological state after 2 years of extreme isolation. A team of doctors and psychologists evaluated him for weeks before determining that he was fit to testify in court. The reunion with his family was the most difficult part of his return to the living world. Marcus's parents wept openly when they saw him, touching his face and hands as if they couldn't quite believe he was real. His brother David alternated between joy and anger, thrilled to have his brother back but furious about the years of uncertainty and grief his disappearance had caused. "Why didn't you trust us to help you?" David asked during one of their first conversations after the reunion. "Why did you think you had to face this alone?" Marcus struggled to answer. The man who had disappeared into the Colorado wilderness 2 years earlier had been driven by fear and desperation. The man who had emerged from Silverbrook was still learning how to exist in relationships again, how to trust other people with knowledge of his vulnerabilities. "I was trying to protect you," Marcus said finally. "I thought if I disappeared completely, they would leave everyone else alone." "That wasn't your decision to make," David replied, but his tone was gentle rather than accusatory. "We're family. We're supposed to face things together." The trials themselves were a kind of exorcism. Marcus testified for 3 weeks, recounting everything he had witnessed at the warehouse and everything that had happened afterward. Defense attorneys tried to discredit his testimony by pointing to his illegal disappearance and false identities, but the prosecution was able to corroborate most of his account with physical evidence and other witness testimony. Vincent Moretti was convicted on multiple charges, and sentenced to life in prison. Thompson received 25 years for his role in the conspiracy. Most of the other participants either accepted plea bargains or were convicted at trial. The criminal network that had once seemed so powerful and threatening was revealed to be a collection of ordinary criminals who had been brought down by their own greed and violence. When the trials ended, Marcus found himself facing another kind of disappearance, the gradual fading of his notoriety as the media moved on to other stories. The man who had been called the ghost who walked home in newspaper headlines slowly became just another person rebuilding his life after trauma. The process was harder than he had expected. After years of existing without paperwork, social security numbers, or official recognition, Marcus had to relearn how to navigate bureaucracy. He had to rebuild credit, renew identification documents, and find employment that would accept his unusual work history. But perhaps the most difficult adjustment was learning to live without the profound silence that had sustained him in Silverbrook. The constant noise of modern civilization, traffic, televisions, other people's conversations, felt overwhelming after years of mountain quiet. Marcus found himself taking long walks in city parks, searching for pockets of peace in an environment that seemed designed to eliminate contemplation. It was during one of these walks that Marcus encountered Sarah Kim for the last time. She was sitting on a bench near a pond, working on her laptop in the late afternoon sun. "How's civilian life treating you?" Sarah asked as Marcus sat down beside her. "It's an adjustment," Marcus admitted. "Sometimes I miss being invisible." Sarah closed her laptop and looked at him thoughtfully. "In my research, I've learned that people who successfully come back from disappearance often struggle more with reintegration than with the original vanishing. It's easier to become a ghost than to stop being one." Marcus nodded, understanding the truth of her observation. "Do you think I made the right choice, coming back?" "I think you made the only choice you could live with long-term," Sarah replied. "Silverbrook was a beautiful refuge, but it wasn't a life. It was a pause between lives." As they sat in comfortable silence, watching ducks navigate the pond, Marcus realized that Sarah was right. His time as a ghost had been necessary for survival, but it had also been preparation for returning to the world as someone stronger and more self-aware than the person who had originally fled. The Marcus Chen who had walked home from the dead was not the same man who had disappeared into the night 2 years earlier. He was someone who had learned to exist in solitude without losing his humanity, someone who understood both the value of visibility and the power of choosing to be unseen. Most importantly, he was someone who had discovered that true freedom was not found in running away from problems or hiding from consequences. True freedom was found in choosing how to engage with life, whether as a ghost haunting the margins of society or as a person willing to stand in the light and face whatever came next. As the sun set over the city pond, Marcus Chen sat quietly with the knowledge that his long journey through invisibility had finally brought him home to himself. The ghost had walked its necessary path, and now it was time for the living man to continue the story.